And we welcome you back to America's Forum. Staying with me here, Newsmax Magazine senior editor David Patton to talk to our next important guest. By way of background, concerns mounting over the Russian military buildup on the Ukrainian border. Fears heightened after Moscow's reported efforts to camouflage troops and equipment. This as the United Nations Security Council meets today to discuss the crisis, and that meeting comes a day after the International Monetary Fund agreed to an $18 billion financial lifeline for Ukraine. Joining us now to discuss this situation and other international concerns, former United States Ambassador to the United Nations, John Bolton. John, we really appreciate your time. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me. Glad to be with you.
Now, John, we're hearing from the Ukrainian government. They're estimating 100,000 Russian troops massed on the border. President Obama, in an interview recorded with CBS News, urging Russia to move the troops away to reduce tension. Does the Obama request carry any weight at all with Mr. Putin?
Well, unfortunately, I don't think so. I mean, I think our response to Russia's policy in Ukraine since the overthrow of the Yanukovych government there has been weak and feckless, and that's being polite. And I think the Russians had sized Obama up over the last 5 years. I think they felt that they could get what they wanted in Ukraine, and honestly went beyond where I thought they would go by moving troops into the Crimea after, by the way, saying that they weren't going to do that. So I don't know what Putin's game is in Ukraine now. I thought he would be satisfied with a regime in Kiev that was subordinate to his wishes, Moscow's wishes. But it may be he intends to go further and carve out more of the of Ukraine and annex it to Russia. But certainly he's not going to pay any attention to President Obama.
Mr. Ambassador, David Patton here. We wanted to show our viewers an advanced look at the upcoming edition of Newsmax Magazine for April, where you actually wrote a terrific cover story that goes behind the scenes and gives a really in-depth look at this dynamic between Obama on the one hand and Putin on the other. Obama's basically saying war is outmoded, and Putin playing, as you know, a very different game. I'm curious, what do you think Vladimir Putin's reaction was yesterday when the president kind of rattled the saber and said, well, the Russians better pull those troops back from the Ukraine?
You know, I don't think they paid the slightest bit of attention to it, because the president has said repeatedly that he wants to negotiate a resolution to this crisis. He doesn't see any role for military force. And I'm not talking here about actual military hostilities. I'm talking about the use of military force, NATO, our allies in NATO, to demonstrate a capability for deterrence. To say to the Russians, you are not going to get away with annexing the Crimea without cost, and you better not think of going any further into the Ukraine. Instead, our president talks endlessly about how shocked he is that the Russians have violated international law. I must say, in the Kremlin, I think they shake their heads every time they hear the president talk. This is a man, we've seen this in case after case around the world, who believes that his rhetoric actually is reality, that he lives in this fog of words, whereas Putin lives in a world of power. And in any competition between the two, there's no doubt which will prevail.
John, former Secretary of State Henry Kissinger has weighed in on the Putin dynamic, I guess we would call it, because Vladimir Putin is someone, as a former KGB agent, he has utilized intimidation with other world leaders. For example, knowing of the German Chancellor's fear of dogs, making sure he had a big one on display when she came to visit. All sorts of efforts psychologically to put people off balance. Is there a way to reshape the stakes here? Because it has been a staple of foreign policy that we need to have a strong counterbalance to what we used to call the Soviet bloc was doing, and now maybe the neo-Soviet bloc. Is there anything we haven't considered that would be effective with Putin? If there were a Bolton doctrine to deal with Putin, John, how would you outline that?
Well, I think part of the problem is that Obama has spent the last 5 years pressing the famous reset button with Putin and Russia generally looking for better relations as if we were the cause of the problem, and has not thought through the implications of what might happen to Ukraine, which was left in between NATO and Russia, like Georgia. George Bush back in 2008 proposed bringing both Ukraine and NATO into Ukraine and Georgia into NATO on a clearly defined path. The Europeans didn't take him up on it, and the Russians invaded Georgia 4 months later. Obama has let 5 years go by without even thinking about that problem. I mean, this is a real issue for NATO. I have to say, the only good thing you can say about Obama's policy on Ukraine is that the Europeans have been worse. Their dependence on Russian oil and gas is a real problem for them. And it does pose an existential problem for NATO. If the Europeans aren't willing to do something about military aggression on their own continent, it's very hard for us to do more. Now, without American leadership, NATO isn't going anywhere either. So you've got both sides of the NATO equation here really in complete disarray.
Well, Mr. Ambassador, you mentioned the infamous reset, and that provokes a natural question, which is, how much responsibility do you believe that former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton has regarding this aggression that we now see, this attitude that Russia can just roll into Crimea and maybe keep going?
Well, I think she's bears a lot of responsibility for it. She didn't, by any reporting we've had, didn't disagree with Obama once during her 4 years as Secretary of State. And she was the one that presented the reset button. She agreed and advocated to give up our missile defense sites in Poland and the Czech Republic. She was a very strong advocate for the New START arms control treaty, a big loss for the United States when the Senate ratified that. She has been the one, along with John Kerry, who has said the Russians would work with us to remove Assad in Syria, which has always been delusional. She was an advocate, as have been Kerry and Biden and Obama, of negotiating with Iran over its nuclear weapons program. She's been in the thick of this, and if she runs for president in 2016, as I think everybody believes she will, her record, her very inadequate record as Secretary of State, is certainly going to be fair game.
Ambassador Bolton, we appreciate your time. We look forward to our next discussion because when you mentioned the presidency, there's some talk about Ambassador Bolton being interested in that job. Dave Patton, great to have you join me on this. We ask you to join us via social media. You can tweet us your comments at Newsmax TV, #America's Forum.